She's not a nanny, she's just a babysitter. We don't pay her or anything, she just likes to feel useful. That's what my daughter-in-law said about me, laughing, to a group of her friends at a birthday party in her own backyard, while I stood 20 feet away holding her youngest child on my hip. I didn't say a word. I set the baby down gently in his father's arms, picked up my purse, and drove home. I did not show up the following Monday, or the Monday after that, or the one after that. 3 weeks later, my daughter-in-law was calling me 4 times a day, and I want to tell you exactly what happened in between. Before I go any further, thank you for being here with me tonight. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country, wherever you happen to be sitting right now. A small note before we start. This story weaves in some fictional elements, for the sake of the telling. The names in the town aren't real, but everything underneath them happened close enough to true that I think it's worth telling. My name is Eleanor Doyle. Most people call me Peggy, a nickname my own grandmother gave me 63 years ago that simply never went away. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a labor and delivery nurse at Fairview Memorial before I retired, and I raised one son, alone, after my husband passed when that son was only 9 years old. I want to tell you about the afternoon my daughter-in-law called me just the babysitter in front of her friends, and about the 3 weeks that followed, and about exactly what she learned during those 3 weeks that she had never once bothered to learn in the 4 years before it. I need you to understand something before this story really gets going. This is not a tale about a bitter old woman punishing a young mother for a careless comment. I am not bitter. I have learned, over a good many years now, that bitterness is what happens when a person swallows an insult and lets it sit and rot in her chest instead of naming it plainly. What I felt that afternoon in the backyard was not bitterness. It was something quieter and considerably more useful. It was clarity, the specific, cold clarity of a woman finally seeing, all at once and in full daylight, a pattern she had been quietly absorbing for 4 years without ever once naming it out loud. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you cannot understand what happened in that backyard without understanding the life I'd built long before my daughter-in-law ever became part of it. I married my husband, Raymond, in the spring of 1979. I was 22, fresh out of nursing school, and Raymond was 25, working as a machinist at a plant 2 towns over. We had our son, Michael, in 1983, and I want to tell you honestly that Raymond was, in every meaningful way, the better parent between the two of us in those early years, patient in a way I was still learning to be, steady in a way that made our small house feel safe regardless of what kind of day either of us had had. Raymond died of a sudden heart attack in 1992, at the plant, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and I was left, at 35, a widow with a 9-year-old son and a mortgage I had never once, in 13 years of marriage, had to think about paying alone. I want you to understand that I do not tell you this to seek your sympathy tonight, though I appreciate it if you feel some. I tell you this because everything that came afterward, every single decision I made raising Michael by myself for the following 9 years until he left for college, was shaped by the specific, unglamorous necessity of a single working mother who did not have the luxury of falling apart for very long. I worked 12-hour shifts at Fairview Memorial, often overnight, because the overnight differential pay made the difference between comfortable and merely surviving. I relied, more than I ever wanted to admit at the time, on a network of neighbors and church friends who watched Michael on the nights I couldn't arrange anything else, and I promised myself, more than once during those hard years, that if I was ever fortunate enough to become a grandmother someday, I would be the kind of grandmother who showed up without being asked twice, who understood, in her bones, exactly how much a genuinely willing pair of extra hands means to an exhausted parent. There is a story from those hard single-parenting years I want to tell you, because I think it explains something about the woman I was long before any of this happened, and about the values that eventually shaped how I responded to what happened in that backyard. In 1995, 3 years after Raymond passed, I was offered a promotion to a supervisory position at Fairview Memorial, a role that would have meant regular daytime hours, better pay, and considerably less physical exhaustion than the overnight labor and delivery shifts I had been working. I turned it down. I remember my own mother asking me why, sitting at my kitchen table much the way Dot would sit at that same table decades later, and I told her that the overnight differential pay, as grueling as the schedule was, meant I could afford a woman named Ruth down the street to watch Michael after school without ever falling behind on the mortgage, and that the daytime supervisory position, for all its comforts, would have actually left us worse off financially once you accounted for the after-school care I'd have needed instead. I tell you this because I want you to understand that I have always been a woman who does the difficult arithmetic honestly, who values a family's actual practical well-being over the appearance of an easier life, and I want you to hold on to that detail, because it matters enormously to how deliberately, and how carefully, I approached everything that happened decades later with Brooke. I want to tell you about one more piece of that early nursing career, because I think it shaped the particular patience I brought to everything that happened later. Labor and delivery is not gentle work, whatever the soft pastel wallpaper in most maternity wings might suggest to visitors. I spent 3 decades in rooms where fear and joy sat side by side in the same hour, sometimes in the same 5 minutes, and I learned, across those years, a specific professional discipline that has stayed with me ever since, that the calmest voice in a difficult room is usually the one doing the most good, and that panic, however understandable, rarely solves anything a steady hand and a clear head couldn't solve better. I tell you this because I think it explains, more than almost anything else I could say, why I did not scream at Brooke in that backyard, why I did not send an angry text that same night, why the entire response I eventually settled on was built around quiet, deliberate action rather than a raised voice. 31 years of that particular discipline does not simply switch off the moment you retire. Michael grew into a good man, careful and steady in a way that reminded me constantly of his father, and in 2016, at 33, he married a woman named Brooke, whom I liked from the very first dinner the 3 of us shared together. Brooke was warm, quick-witted, ambitious in her career as a marketing director for a regional retail chain, and I want to be honest and tell you that in the early years of their marriage, I genuinely believed I had been given a daughter rather than simply a daughter-in-law, the 2 of us texting recipes back and forth, going shopping together most Saturdays, Brooke calling me some weeks simply to talk, the way a daughter calls a mother. About nothing in particular. I want to tell you about one specific memory from those early years, because I think it matters to understanding exactly how far the relationship had drifted by the time of the birthday party. In the spring of 2018, before either grandchild had even been born, Brooke called me one Tuesday evening simply to ask my opinion on a work conflict she was having with a colleague, the kind of call a young woman makes to a mother she genuinely trusts, not out of any practical need, but out of real emotional closeness. We talked for nearly an hour that evening, and I remember hanging up the phone afterward and thinking, with real gratitude, that Michael had married a woman who had chosen, of her own accord, to build something genuine with me rather than simply tolerating me as an obligatory in-law. I want you to hold on to that memory, because I think it makes the eventual backyard comment sting all the more, set against how much warmth had once existed so easily between us. They had their first child, a daughter named Josephine, in 2019, and their second, a son named Theodore, in 2021, and it was around the birth of Theodore that I began, without either of us ever formally arranging it, providing what amounted to nearly full-time childcare for both children, 3, sometimes 4 days a week, while Brooke worked and Michael traveled for his job in commercial insurance. I want to be clear about the scope of what I actually provided, because I think the details matter enormously to everything that happened later. I picked Josephine up from preschool 3 mornings a week and kept her the entire day. I watched Theodore, then an infant, on those same days, feeding him, changing him, putting him down for naps, in Brooke and Michael's own home, because it was easier for the children to stay in their own environment than to be shuttled to mine. I did this, for years running, entirely without pay, because I was their grandmother, and because I genuinely loved doing it, and because I had promised myself, all those years earlier during my own hard, exhausted single-parenting years, that I would be exactly this kind of grandmother if I ever got the chance. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with my closest friend, Dot Winslow, in the spring of 2022, roughly a year into this arrangement, because I think it foreshadows something important about the pattern that eventually led to the backyard confrontation. Peggy Dot said to me over coffee one Tuesday morning, our standing weekly ritual for nearly 2 decades, "You know I love you, and you know I think you're a wonderful grandmother. But I've noticed something, and I want to say it to you plainly, because I don't think anyone else is going to. You've been watching those children 3-4 days a week for over a year now, and I have never once heard you mention Brooke or Michael offering to pay you, or even just saying thank you in any way that sounds like they understand what you're actually giving up to do this." I remember brushing this off at the time, telling Dot that I didn't do it for money, that grandmothers aren't supposed to expect payment for loving their grandchildren, and Dot had nodded, patiently, the way an old friend nods when she knows pushing further won't accomplish anything yet, but she isn't quite ready to let the point go entirely either. "Peggy," she'd said, "there's a difference between not expecting payment and never once being thanked. Those are 2 very different things, and I think you're letting yourself confuse them." I did not fully absorb what Dot was telling me that spring. I want to be honest about that. I continued the arrangement exactly as it was for another 2 years, watching the children with genuine joy, telling myself, whenever a small, uncomfortable feeling crept in, that I was simply fortunate to be needed, fortunate to be close enough to my grandchildren to be trusted with their care so completely. I want to tell you about a few specific incidents from those 2 years, small ones individually, that I think, looking back now, formed the actual shape of the pattern long before the backyard party made it impossible to ignore any longer. In the fall of 2022, Brooke and Michael took a 5-day anniversary trip to the coast, leaving both children with me for the entire stretch, which I was glad to do. Genuinely glad, though I want you to notice that this was 5 consecutive days and nights of full-time care for a preschooler and a toddler, provided by a 65-year-old woman, without any offer of compensation, and without, as I recall now, either of them calling to check on the children more than once during the entire trip. In the spring of 2023, Brooke returned to work from a brief medical leave and asked me, somewhat abruptly over a Sunday phone call, whether I could add a 4th day to my regular schedule, because their childcare budget, she explained, was tight that quarter and they were trying to avoid the cost of a part-time nanny for the additional day. I agreed, of course, because that is simply the kind of thing you do for family, but I want you to notice the specific phrasing she used. Their childcare budget was tight, implying, without ever quite saying it outright, that my care was the free alternative being substituted for the paid alternative they would otherwise have had to budget for. In the summer of 2023, I overheard Brooke, on a phone call with her own sister that I was not meant to be listening to, describing her childcare situation as basically solved, thank God, since Michael's mom is retired and has nothing else going on most days, so she just comes over. I want you to sit with that phrase the way I had to sit with it, standing quietly in the next room with a laundry basket in my hands. Nothing else going on. 4 years of my own retirement, my own hard-earned freedom after 31 years of overnight nursing shifts, described casually, to her sister, as nothing else going on, as though my time simply existed in an empty holding pattern until Brooke found a use for it. I did not confront her about that overheard comment at the time. I want to be honest about why. I told myself, the way people often tell themselves these things, that I had misheard the tone, that Brooke surely meant it more affectionately than it had sounded standing in that hallway, that raising it directly would create tension in a relationship I valued more than my own hurt feelings. I have learned since then that this particular kind of self-talk, however well-intentioned, is often simply the sound of a person quietly training herself to accept less respect than she actually deserves. I want to tell you about one more incident from that stretch of years, roughly a year before the birthday party, because I think it shows that Michael himself had begun, in his own quiet way, to notice the same pattern I was noticing, even before either of us said anything about it directly to each other. In the spring of 2024, Michael mentioned to me, almost in passing over a Sunday dinner, that he'd overheard Brooke on a call with her own mother describing the children's schedule for the week, listing off, matter-of-factly, the days I would be covering, followed by the phrase, "and then Mom's got them Thursday, so I don't even have to think about it." Michael told me this not as a complaint against Brooke, but almost as an observation he wasn't quite sure what to do with. The way you mention a small thing that's been sitting oddly with you without yet having the words to explain why. I remember telling him, at the time, that I didn't mind not having to be thought about, that being a reliable, low-maintenance part of their week was exactly the kind of grandmother I wanted to be. I want you to notice, looking back, how readily I reframed something that should perhaps have troubled me into something I told myself was a virtue instead. I have wondered since whether Michael's mentioning it that evening was itself a small, early attempt to check whether I'd noticed the same thing he had, and whether my quick reassurance, meant kindly, actually closed off a conversation that might have been worth having a full year earlier than it eventually happened. The birthday party itself happened in June, for Josephine's 5th birthday, held in Brooke and Michael's own backyard, with roughly a dozen of Brooke's friends from the neighborhood and from her office, along with their own children, gathered for the afternoon. I had, as I always did for the children's birthdays, spent the better part of 2 days beforehand baking a proper cake from scratch, Josephine's favorite, a lemon cake with raspberry filling, along with helping set up decorations that morning before the guests arrived. I want to tell you about the specific moment itself, because I have gone over it in my mind many times since, and I want you to have it exactly as it happened rather than smoothed over in any direction. I was standing near the patio table, holding Theodore, then not quite 2 years old, on my hip, while he fussed slightly from the heat, and a small cluster of Brooke's friends, women I had met perhaps half a dozen times before at various gatherings, were standing nearby with plastic cups of lemonade, admiring the party setup. One of them, a woman named Christine whom I understood to be one of Brooke's closer friends from her office, gestured toward me and asked Brooke, in the easy, curious way people ask about unfamiliar faces at a party, "Oh, is that your nanny? She's wonderful with him." I want you to understand that I did not take offense at the question itself. It was an entirely reasonable assumption for a stranger to make, watching a woman my age holding a toddler competently while the actual parents mingled elsewhere. What happened next is the part that mattered. Brooke laughed, an easy, dismissive laugh, and said, "Oh, no, that's just Michael's mom. She's not a nanny, she's just a babysitter. We don't pay her or anything, she just likes to feel useful, gets her out of the house. You know how retired people get bored." Christine laughed along, the two of them moving on almost immediately to some other topic, the comment tossed off so lightly that I do not believe, even now, Brooke thought there was anything remarkable about having said it at all. I stood there for a long moment, Theodore's small weight warm against my hip, and I want to tell you honestly what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters more than the anger did. What I felt first was not anger. It was a kind of vertigo, the specific dizziness of hearing, spoken plainly and casually in front of strangers, the exact thing I had spent 2 years quietly suspecting but never allowing myself to fully believe was true, that 4 years of daily, devoted, unpaid care for 2 children had been mentally filed away, by the woman I had once believed considered me a genuine second mother. As something a bored retiree does to feel useful, rather than as the substantial, valuable, load-bearing contribution to her family's actual life that it plainly, obviously was. I carried Theodore over to where Michael was standing, near the grill, and set him gently into his father's arms. I told Michael, quietly, that I had a headache and needed to head home, which was not entirely untrue, though the headache had very little to do with the sun. I picked up my purse from the patio chair where I'd set it that morning, and I drove home, and I did not cry until I was safely inside my own kitchen with the door closed behind me. I need to tell you now about a phone call I made that same evening, because I think it explains a great deal about how deliberately, and how quietly, everything that followed was actually built. I called Dot Winslow, sitting alone at my own kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of me, and I told her exactly what had happened, word for word, as close as I could remember it. "Peggy," Dot said, after I'd finished, her voice carrying none of the "I told you so" I might have half expected and fully deserved. "I'm not going to say anything you don't already know. I'm just going to ask you one question. What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," I told her honestly. "I need to think. I need you to understand something about my own temperament before I tell you what I decided, because I think it explains why the decision took the shape it eventually took. I am not, by nature, a confrontational woman. 31 years as a labor and delivery nurse teaches you a particular kind of patience, a habit of managing difficult moments calmly rather than dramatically, of understanding that the loudest reaction in a room is rarely the most effective one. I did not want to call Brooke that night and demand an apology. I did not want to raise my voice, or make a scene, or turn Josephine's 5th birthday into the memory of the afternoon her grandmother and mother had a fight in the backyard. What I decided, sitting at that kitchen table with my tea gone entirely cold, was something quieter, and I believe, looking back now, considerably more effective than anything a raised voice could have accomplished. I simply stopped showing up. I did not announce this decision to Brooke or Michael. I did not send an angry text explaining my reasoning. I simply did not appear the following Monday morning, the day I would ordinarily have arrived by 8 to collect Josephine from preschool and settle in with Theodore for the day. I turned off my phone that morning, deliberately, and I drove myself to the botanical gardens across town instead, a place I had not visited in nearly 6 years, and I spent the entire day walking slowly through the rose garden, sitting on benches, reading a novel I had started and abandoned 3 separate times over the preceding year, doing, in short, exactly the kind of unhurried, self-directed thing a genuinely retired woman with nothing pressing to attend to might reasonably choose to do. With her Monday. I need to pause here, because what happened over the following 3 weeks is the part one think matters most, and I don't want to rush past it. If you're still with me, drop the number 4 in the comments. That's how many years I'd been providing that care, so I know you're still sitting with me through this. Fair warning, the story from here weaves in a few more fictional elements to bring the truth of it to life more clearly. If that's not the kind of telling you're looking for, this is a fine place to step away, with my full respect. For those staying, let's keep going. Brooke called me at 11 that Monday morning, and I let it go to voicemail. She called again at 1, and again at 3, and I let each call go to voicemail in turn, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely needed the day itself to simply be quiet, to be mine, before I was ready to have any conversation at all about what had happened at that party. I listened to her voicemails that evening, sitting again at my own kitchen table. The first, from 11, was brisk and mildly irritated, asking where I was, reminding me I was supposed to have Josephine from preschool at 11:30. The second, from 1, carried a noticeably sharper edge, Brooke's voice tight with the particular stress of a working parent whose carefully arranged day has suddenly and unexpectedly collapsed. The third, from 3, had shifted into something closer to worry, Brooke asking, more gently now, whether I was all right, whether something had happened, whether I needed her to call anyone. I did not call her back that night. I want to be honest with you about why, because I think the reasoning matters more than the silence itself. I was not punishing Brooke by withholding a phone call. I was giving myself the space I genuinely needed to decide, with a clear head rather than a wounded one, exactly what I wanted to say, and exactly what I wanted the next chapter of my relationship with my daughter-in-law to actually look like, once I finally did speak with her. I called Michael instead, my own son, the following morning, Tuesday, and I told him plainly what had happened at the party, the comment Brooke had made to her friend, the specific words, just the babysitter, we don't pay her, she just likes to feel useful. Michael was quiet for a long moment on the phone. Mom, he finally said, I didn't hear her say that. I was over by the grill. If I'd heard it, I promise you I would have said something right then. I believe you, I told him, and I meant it. I did not believe Michael had witnessed the comment and let it pass. I believed, and I still believe now, that my son genuinely valued what I had been doing for his children, in a way that his wife, for whatever reason, had somehow stopped fully seeing. But Michael, I said, I need you to understand something, and I need you to actually hear it rather than simply trying to smooth it over the way I suspect you're about to try to do. I have given 4 years of daily, unpaid, full-time care to your children, care that would cost you and Brooke a substantial sum of money every single month if you had to replace it with a professional nanny or a daycare center. I have done that gladly, Because I love Josephine and Theodore more than almost anything else in this world. But I am not going to continue showing up to be quietly described, in front of Brooke's friends, as a bored retiree who likes to feel useful. That is not what I am, Michael, and it is not what I have been doing for the past 4 years, and I need both of you to understand the difference before I set foot back in that house. Michael had been quiet again for a moment. Mom, he finally said, I'll talk to Brooke. I promise you, I'll talk to her. I told him that talking to her was a good start, but that I needed more than a conversation held on my behalf. I told him, some time away from the regular schedule, not as a punishment, but because I genuinely needed to think clearly about what role I wanted to continue playing in their family's daily life, and I could not think clearly while still showing up every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday as though nothing at all had happened. I did not go back that Tuesday, or that Thursday, or the following week at all. I want to tell you about what those 3 weeks actually looked like from my side of things, because I think the fuller, more honest shape of it matters more than a shorter telling might suggest. I spent the first several days simply resting, in the specific way a person rests after finally setting down a weight she had not fully realized how heavy it had become. I slept later than I had in years. I had lunch with Dot twice that first week instead of our usual once, long, unhurried lunches where either of us was watching a clock for a preschool pickup. I started, finally, the garden project I had been talking about for 2 full years without ever finding the time to actually begin it, tearing out an overgrown flower bed along the side of my house and replanting it properly, the kind of slow, physical, satisfying work that gives a person's hands something honest to do while her mind works through something harder. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Dot during that first week, because I think it captures something important about what I was actually feeling, underneath the surface calm I was working hard to maintain. Peggy, Dot said, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table on the Wednesday of that first week, you look more rested than I've seen you look in 2 years. And you also look like you're grieving something. Both those things can be true at once, you know. I told her that was exactly right, that I missed Josephine and Theodore terribly, that not seeing them every day felt like a genuine loss, not a triumph, however necessary the loss might currently be. But Dot, I said, I think I needed to lose the daily routine to actually understand how much of my own identity I'd quietly poured into being available for it, without ever once asking whether that availability was actually valued the way I assumed it was. Brooke called nearly every day that first week, and I answered most of those calls, though I kept them brief, cordial, without any of the coldness that might have made the situation feel like an outright feud rather than what it actually was, a grandmother taking a deliberate, necessary pause. I told her, each time, some version of the same thing. I need some time, Brooke. I'm not angry in the way that means I never want to see you again. I'm hurt in the way that means I need to understand what actually happened before I can go back to how things were. By the second week, I want to be honest with you, the calls from Brooke had begun to carry a genuinely different quality than the earlier ones had. The childcare situation, I gathered secondhand from Michael, who called me most evenings that fortnight, had become considerably more difficult than either of them had anticipated. Brooke had tried, in the first week, to cobble together a patchwork of solutions, a few days at a local daycare center that happened to have last-minute openings, a couple of days borrowed from a neighbor with children the same age, one day where Michael himself worked from home to cover the gap. By the second week, the patchwork had begun, predictably, to fray. I learned, from Michael, that Josephine's preschool did not offer full-day extended care on the days Brooke needed it, requiring an entirely separate afternoon arrangement that the daycare center, once contacted, quoted at nearly $900 a month for the additional hours alone, a figure that did not include any care at all for Theodore, whose own daycare waitlist, it turned out, when Brooke finally called to inquire, ran nearly 4 months long at every reputable facility within a reasonable driving distance. I want to tell you honestly that I did not feel triumphant hearing any of this. I felt, instead, a complicated, aching kind of vindication, the particular feeling of a suspicion you had hoped was wrong being confirmed, an exhausting, expensive, granular detail, exactly as right as you had feared it might be. Michael called me on the Thursday of the second week, his voice carrying a tiredness I recognized immediately, the specific exhaustion of a man caught between two people he loves, each of whom he believes, at least partially, has a legitimate grievance against the other. "Mom," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I want you to hear it honestly rather than as an attempt to guilt you back into the schedule before you're ready. This week has been genuinely hard for us. Brooke had to leave work early twice because the daycare backup fell through. We're paying almost $1,200 this month just trying to patch together 2 weeks of coverage, and it's still not fully covered. I'm not telling you this to pressure you. I'm telling you because I think it's important you understand exactly what your 4 years of help actually meant, in a way that maybe none of us, including me, fully appreciated until we didn't have it anymore." I told Michael I was genuinely sorry they were struggling, and I meant that sincerely, because I have never once, in all of this, wanted my son's family to suffer. "But I need you to understand something too, Michael," I said. "I'm not staying away to make a point about money. I'm staying away because I need to know, clearly and honestly, whether Brooke actually understands what she said that day, and whether she's willing to say so directly to me, rather than simply missing the free help enough to want it back on the old terms. I want to tell you more about those 3 weeks themselves, because I think the fuller, messier texture of them matters more than a shorter telling would suggest." Dot came by nearly every few days during that stretch, not to push me in either direction, but simply to sit with me while I worked through what I actually wanted, and I remember one particular afternoon in the second week when she asked me directly whether I was afraid the whole thing might end permanently, whether Brooke might simply decide the fight over dignity wasn't worth patching things up over. I told Dot, honestly, that I had considered that possibility, and that I had made a kind of peace with it before I ever stopped showing up that first Monday. "Dot," I said, "if the cost of being treated with basic respect by my own daughter-in-law is that our relationship doesn't survive it, then I think I need to know that now, at 67, rather than finding it out at 75 when I have even less time left to spend building something healthier instead." Dot had reached across the table and squeezed my hand at that, the particular gesture of an old friend who understands exactly how much conviction it takes to say a thing like that out loud and actually mean it. "I want to tell you, too, about the specific financial reality Michael eventually shared with me in more detail, because I think the numbers themselves matter to understanding exactly what 4 years of unpaid care had actually been worth." By the middle of the second week, Brooke had gathered formal quotes from 3 separate childcare providers in an effort to solve the coverage gap permanently rather than week to week. The most affordable option, a home daycare 2 streets over from their own house, quoted an all-in monthly rate, for both children combined, of just over $2,200, a figure that did not include the extended afternoon hours Josephine sometimes needed when Brooke's meetings ran long, nor any allowance for sick days, which the provider charged separately, and at a premium. I want you to sit with that number the way I eventually had to sit with it myself, hearing it secondhand from my own son. $2,200 a month, roughly $26,000 a year, for care I had been providing, gladly and without complaint, entirely free of charge, for 4 consecutive years. I do not tell you this number to shame Brooke, or to suggest that love should be measured in dollar figures. I tell you this number because I think it illustrates, in the plainest possible terms, exactly how invisible genuinely substantial, valuable labor can become once it is offered freely and out of love, and exactly how easily that invisibility can curdle, without anyone quite intending it to, into casual disrespect. I want to tell you about a conversation between Michael and Brooke themselves during that second week, one Michael told me about much later, once enough time had passed that he felt comfortable sharing it honestly. He told me that Brooke had, at one particularly stressful point that week, snapped at him, half joking and half not, that maybe they should just call his mother and grovel, and Michael had told her, plainly, that he wasn't willing to ask me to grovel for anything, that if anyone owed an apology in this situation, it wasn't me. He told me that Brooke had gone quiet after that, and that it was, he believed, one of the first moments she genuinely began separating the practical inconvenience of losing my help from the actual, harder question of whether she had done something that deserved to cost her that help in the first place. I want to tell you also about the daycare search itself in a bit more detail, because I think the specific texture of those 2 weeks matters. Brooke visited 3 separate facilities in person during that stretch, taking half days off work each time, touring waiting rooms with fluorescent lighting and rows of identical cots, filling out lengthy enrollment applications that required background documentation, immunization records, emergency contact forms. Deposits that in 2 of the 3 cases were non-refundable regardless of whether a spot ever actually opened up. She told me, much later, that standing in the hallway of the second facility, watching a harried, kind but clearly overworked young woman try to manage 11 toddlers alone, she had thought, for the first time with real, specific clarity, about exactly how much undivided, patient, unhurried attention I had been giving her own children every single day for 4 years, attention that no institutional daycare, however well run, could ever quite replicate at any price. I called Brooke myself, near the end of that second week, because I think the conversation I'm about to describe matters as much as the one she initiated. Actually, it was Brooke who called me first that Friday, and I want to tell you about that call now, because it captures the actual turning point of this entire story more clearly than almost anything else I could tell you. "Peggy," she said when I picked up, her voice sounding smaller than I had heard it sound in a long while, stripped of the easy, breezy confidence I associated with her. "Can we talk? Really talk, I mean. Not just the check-in calls we've been having." I told her that I was willing to talk whenever she was ready. She came by that Saturday afternoon, alone, without the children, and we sat together at my kitchen table, the same table where I had sat with my cold tea the night of the party, and for a long while she said nothing at all, simply turning a coffee cup slowly between her hands, the way people do when they are gathering courage for something they know needs saying. "I've been replaying that comment in my head for 2 weeks now," she finally said. "Just the babysitter, we don't pay her, she just likes to feel useful. I keep hearing myself say it, and every time I hear it, I feel sick, Peggy. I said that about you. About 4 years of you showing up, every single week, rain or shine, doing the actual, hard, unglamorous work of raising my children alongside me, and I reduced it, in front of my friend, to a bored old woman filling her empty days. I don't even fully understand why I said it. I think," she stopped, swallowing hard before continuing, "I think some part of me had gotten so used to your help being there that I stopped actually seeing it as help at all. It just became the water I was swimming in, invisible, the way you stopped noticing the air you're breathing. And when Christine asked if you were the nanny, I think I panicked a little, worried what it said about me and Michael that we relied so heavily on family instead of paying for proper childcare like everyone else at that party seemed to, and instead of just saying, 'Yes, that's my mother-in-law, and we're incredibly lucky to have her,' I made this ugly joke instead. To make myself look more independent in front of people I barely even like that much." I let her sit in that silence for a moment before I responded, because I think some silences need to be sat inside fully before anyone tries to fill them with reassurance. "Brooke," I finally said, "I appreciate you saying all of that, and I believe you mean it. But I need you to understand something, and I need you to hear it clearly, because it matters more than the apology itself. What you said that day was not simply a careless joke. It revealed something you had genuinely started to believe, somewhere along the way, about the value of what I've been doing. And I think the real question in front of us isn't whether you're sorry for the joke. It's whether, going forward, you actually see my time and my care as something valuable enough to be respected, in both the small daily ways and the larger ones, or whether we're simply going to return to the exact same arrangement, on the exact same invisible terms, the moment your childcare crisis gets uncomfortable enough." Brooke had nodded slowly at that, her eyes wet though she wasn't crying outright, holding the emotion at the edge the way people do when they are trying to stay composed enough to keep talking. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "I mean that honestly. What would actually make this right, not just today, but going forward?" I want to tell you about the conversation that followed, because I think the specific, practical shape of what we agreed to matters as much as the emotional repair itself, and I don't want to skip past it in favor of a tidier, more purely sentimental resolution. I told Brooke, plainly, that I was willing to continue helping with the children, because I loved them and because I did not want this entire painful chapter to end with me simply withdrawing from their daily lives out of wounded pride. But I told her that the arrangement going forward needed to look different in several specific ways. First, I wanted a modest, formal payment for my time, not because I needed the money, but because I believed, and had come to believe firmly over those 3 weeks, that unpaid labor is too easily undervalued, however loving the intention behind offering it for free might originally have been, and that a small monthly payment would serve as a concrete, ongoing acknowledgement of the actual worth of what I was providing. Second, I wanted us to establish a genuine schedule, agreed upon in advance rather than expanded unilaterally whenever their own budget got tight, so that my time felt like a respected commitment rather than an infinitely elastic backup resource. Third, and this mattered to me more than either of the practical arrangements, I wanted Brooke to correct the record directly, with the same friend in front of whom the original comment had been made, so that the correction existed publicly, in the same space the insult had occurred, rather than remaining a private matter resolved quietly between the two of us alone. Brooke agreed to all 3 conditions without hesitation, and I want to tell you honestly that I was somewhat surprised by how readily she agreed to the third one in particular, which I had expected might be the hardest for her to accept. Actually, Peggy, she said, I already fixed part of that, though I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure it would matter to you. I called Christine last week and told her the truth. I told her that you're not a babysitter, and you never have been. I told her you're the reason our family functions, that you've given up years of your own retirement to make sure our children are loved and cared for every single day, and that the joke I made at the party was cruel and completely untrue, and that I was ashamed of myself for saying it in front of her. I did not have an immediate response to that, the way I have found, again and again over the years, that some of the most honest apologies simply require silence before they require an answer. We formalized the new arrangement the following week, a modest weekly payment, agreed upon together rather than dictated by either of us alone, and a fixed schedule of 3 days, set in advance for the coming quarter, adjustable only by mutual agreement rather than unilateral expansion during a tight budget month. I returned to Josephine and Theodore the following Monday, and I want to tell you that the reunion itself, watching Josephine run across the living room to hug my legs the moment I walked through the door, undid something in my chest that 3 weeks of careful, deliberate distance had held tightly closed. I want to tell you about one more conversation from that second week, before I bring you to the resolution, because I think it matters to the fuller shape of the story. Josephine, then 5 years old, had apparently asked her mother, on more than one occasion during those 3 weeks, where Grandma Peggy had gone, and why she wasn't coming on Mondays anymore. Michael relayed this to me carefully, gently, clearly uncertain whether telling me would feel like emotional pressure or simply an honest piece of information I deserved to have. I want to be honest and tell you that hearing it did affect me deeply, in exactly the complicated way you might expect. It did not make me rush back before I was ready. But it confirmed something I already believed, which is that the ache of that absence was not one-sided, that a 5-year-old girl missing her grandmother mattered every bit as much as an exhausted mother missing her free childcare, and that both of those truths could exist honestly, side by side, without either one canceling out the other. I want to tell you about the day I actually returned, because I think the specific texture of it matters. Josephine ran across the living room the moment I walked through the door, wrapping both arms around my legs with the complete, uncomplicated relief only a small child can express, and said, "Grandma, you were gone forever." I knelt down and told her I was sorry it felt that long, and that I was not going anywhere again for a very long while, and I want you to understand that saying those words to my granddaughter, with the new arrangement genuinely in place behind them, felt entirely different than it would have felt saying the same words 3 weeks earlier, before anything had actually changed. I want to tell you about one more thread from that period, before I bring this to a close, because I think it matters to the fuller shape of the story. Michael and I had a conversation, roughly 2 months after the new arrangement began, sitting on my own back porch on an ordinary Sunday evening while Brooke put the children to bed inside. "Mom," he said, "I need to say something, and I've been putting it off because I'm embarrassed about it." I should have said something at that party myself, the moment I realized what Brooke had said, even though I didn't hear it happen live. When you told me about it afterward, some part of me wanted to just smooth it over quickly, get everyone back to normal, because normal was easier for me. I think I've done that more than once over the years, actually. Let something slide because addressing it properly felt harder than just letting it pass. I'm sorry I let you carry that by yourself for as long as you did. I did not have an immediate response to that, the way I have found, again and again, that some of the most honest admissions in this whole story have simply required silence before they required an answer. Thank you for saying that, I finally told him. I think I needed to hear it about as much as you needed to say it. I want to tell you about one particular moment from several months later, because I think it captures, better than almost anything else I could tell you, exactly how much genuinely shifted in Brooke over that period. We were at another gathering that fall, a smaller one this time, just a handful of neighborhood families for a Sunday cookout, and I was once again holding Theodore, now walking steadily on his own 2 feet most of the time, though he'd grown tired and wanted to be carried for a while. A woman I did not recognize, a newer neighbor on their street, asked Brooke, in the same easy, curious way Christine once had, "Oh, is that your babysitter?" I felt myself brace, instinctively, for a version of the old answer. Brooke did not laugh it off this time. "That's my mother-in-law Peggy," she said, warmly, without any hesitation at all. "She's the reason I've been able to keep my career going these past 4 years. Honestly, I don't know what our family would do without her." I did not say anything in that moment, standing there with Theodore's warm, sleepy weight against my shoulder, but I want to tell you that something in me, some small, tightly held place that had been aching quietly since that afternoon in June, finally, genuinely, let go. If there is a lesson in this story, and I believe there is one, it is this. Love given freely does not mean love that deserves to go unacknowledged, and a family member who quietly absorbs disrespect for the sake of keeping the peace teaches the people around her, however unintentionally, that her time and her dignity are simply available for the taking, regardless of how genuinely she loves the people she is giving them to. I did not stop showing up because I stopped loving my grandchildren. I stopped showing up because I needed my daughter-in-law to understand, plainly and completely, exactly what she stood to lose, before either of us could honestly rebuild what came next on better, sturdier ground. I believe a grandmother's love is not a bottomless, invisible resource to be quietly relied upon and casually dismissed in the same breath. I believe respect and love are supposed to travel together, always, and that a family which learns to separate the two, even briefly, even unintentionally, owes itself the honest correction before the separation becomes permanent. If any part of this story stayed with you tonight, tell me in the comments. I read every one. If someone you know is quietly giving more of themselves to their family than anyone around them has bothered to notice, share this with them gently. It costs you nothing, and it might be exactly the reminder they need that their own dignity is allowed to matter too. Subscribe if you'd like to stay close. There is more of this family's story worth telling. Thank you, truly, for staying with me all the way to the end. One final note before you go. The chapters in this telling carry fictionalized elements woven in to bring a human truth to life more clearly. If that isn't the kind of content you're looking for, no hard feelings at all, choose what serves you, and take good care of yourself.